Miami, Florida, USA. A city alive with tropical energy, vibrant colors, and endless summer. But for Ethan Harper, it was just another place to blend into the background. 32 years old, well-built but tired, Ethan wasn't the same man he once was. He had packed up his life in New York, leaving behind a well-paying but soul-crushing finance job after years of burnout. His heart, though, had taken the real hit. A long-term relationship had ended 6 months ago, shattering his faith in love. Now, sitting alone at a beachside café along Ocean Drive, Ethan stared into his coffee cup, the sun setting in the distance over the Atlantic Ocean. He had come to Miami to start fresh, but deep inside, he was numb. His friends had urged him to take a break. "You need to clear your head, man. Miami's good for the soul." But nothing felt good anymore. Miami's electric nightlife was starting to buzz around him. People laughed, and couples strolled by hand in hand, only reminding Ethan of what he no longer had. He adjusted his sunglasses and leaned back, wondering if love was just one of those things. Great for others, but not meant for him. That's when he saw her. Leah Martinez walked into the cafe with the kind of energy that could change the atmosphere in any room. She wasn't flashy, didn't have the loud confidence that Miami often celebrated. Instead, it was her quiet grace that caught Ethan's attention. Her black hair was pulled into a loose bun, and she had a simple elegance about her. Jeans, a white blouse, and an effortless smile that seemed to melt the world around her. She didn't notice Ethan. She was too busy greeting the barista, chatting like old friends. Ethan felt something stir in him, an unfamiliar feeling he thought was long gone. He tried to shake it off. "Don't be stupid, Ethan. Just drink your coffee and go," he muttered to himself. But his gaze betrayed him as it followed Leah. She was seated a few tables down, lost in her book, occasionally sipping her iced coffee. The simplicity of the moment struck him. He wanted to talk to her, but the fear of being hurt again froze him. Besides, what would he even say? "Hey, I gave up on love, but your smile is making me reconsider." Ridiculous. Still, something about her pulled him in. As Leah stood up to leave, her phone slipped from her hand, bouncing onto the floor. Without thinking, Ethan rushed over and picked it up before she could react. "Hey, you dropped this," he said, handing the phone back to her. Leah's smile grew even brighter as she looked up. "Thank you. I can be such a klutz sometimes." She laughed, and Ethan found himself chuckling along despite himself. "No problem. Happens to the best of us." He hesitated for a second before adding, "Mind if I sit?" Leah paused, giving him a curious look. But then she gestured to the chair in front of her. "Sure, I was just about to leave, but I guess I can stay a bit longer." Ethan sat, and for the first time in months, he felt the weight of loneliness lift just a little. They talked for what felt like hours. Leah was a freelance graphic designer, originally from Los Angeles, who had moved to Miami a few years ago to chase a new chapter in her life. She loved the diversity, the art, and the endless energy of the city. Unlike Ethan, Leah hadn't given up on love, but she also hadn't found anything that felt real in a while. "So, what about you, Ethan? What brings you to Miami?" Leah asked, her brown eyes sparkling with genuine curiosity. Ethan sighed, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. "I guess I'm trying to find something. I don't know if it's love, happiness, or maybe just myself again. It's been a rough few months." Leah nodded, her gaze softening. "Miami's a good place to get lost and found, you know. It's unpredictable." For the first time in a long while, Ethan smiled. A real smile. Maybe Leah was right. Maybe Miami could be unpredictable in the best possible way. As the sun dipped fully below the horizon, Leah stood up, gathering her things. "I should go. But if you're ever around here again, I usually stop by this place after work. Maybe we could chat again sometime?" Ethan nodded, feeling a strange sense of hope. "Yeah, I'd like that." Leah flashed him one last smile before disappearing into the busy night, leaving Ethan sitting there, his coffee long gone cold. He watched the spot where she'd stood for a moment, then looked out at the Miami skyline. Something had shifted. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For the first time in months, Ethan felt like maybe, just maybe, love wasn't as far out of reach as he had thought. Ethan found himself returning to the same beachside cafe over the next few days. His usual routine of solitude had changed. Every evening, he would glance toward the door, hoping Leah might walk in again. Though they had only spoken once, Her presence had sparked something inside him, and he didn't want to let it go. But after 3 days of no sign of her, Ethan began to wonder if their brief encounter was just a passing moment. Maybe she forgot about me, he thought, but deep down, he knew that smile was genuine. She hadn't looked at him the way people usually did when they were just being polite. Then, on a humid Wednesday evening, when Ethan was beginning to lose hope, Leah walked through the cafe doors again. This time, she wasn't alone. A man, tall, fit, and casually dressed, followed her inside. He had an easy, confident swagger about him, the kind that made him instantly likable, or instantly hated, depending on the circumstances. Ethan's heart sank. Of course she has a boyfriend, he thought. Why wouldn't she? He watched them from his corner table as Leah and the man approached the counter, chatting casually. They looked comfortable together, and Ethan felt a pang of jealousy rise in his chest. He didn't want to feel it, but there it was. Leah hadn't noticed him yet, and for a brief moment Ethan considered leaving, walking out before she could see him. But something stopped him. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the hope that there was some other explanation. Either way, he stayed seated, his coffee forgotten on the table in front of him. The man walked away to take a phone call, leaving Leah alone at the counter. That's when she spotted Ethan. Her face lit up with that same warm smile, and she made her way over to his table. "Hey, stranger," Leah greeted him cheerfully. "I was wondering if I'd run into you again." Ethan forced a smile, his eyes flickering toward the man who was still talking on his phone near the entrance. "Yeah, I wasn't sure if I'd see you again either." Leah followed his gaze and quickly waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, that's just my brother, Miguel. He's visiting from LA. Don't worry, he's harmless." She grinned, and Ethan felt a wave of relief wash over him. Her brother, not a boyfriend. Leah sat down, and as they started talking, the conversation flowed easily again, just like the first time. There was no pretense, no awkward small talk. They dove into deeper topics, sharing stories of their childhood, their families, and their dreams for the future. Ethan learned that Leah had moved to Miami to escape the overwhelming pressure of her family's expectations in LA. Her parents had wanted her to settle down, to marry someone from their close-knit community, but Leah had always been more independent, more free-spirited, and Miami represented that freedom for her. "I love my family, but I needed space to figure out who I really am, you know?" Leah explained, "Sometimes I feel like people try to put you in a box, and Miami is the one place where I don't feel boxed in." Ethan nodded, understanding all too well what she meant. "Yeah, I get it. I came here for a similar reason. After my last relationship ended, I needed to get out of New York. It was like the city was suffocating me." Leah tilted her head slightly, her eyes softening with empathy. "I know the feeling. It's hard to breathe when your heart's still hurting." Their connection deepened that night, and by the time Leah and Miguel left, Ethan felt a sense of hope growing inside him. He wasn't sure if it was love. He wasn't ready to call it that yet. But it was something. And that something was more than he had felt in a long time. Days turned into weeks, and before Ethan knew it, he and Leah were meeting regularly. What started as casual meetups at the cafe turned into evening walks along the beach, sharing quiet moments by the water and exploring Miami's hidden gems together. They laughed often, bonded over their mutual love for art and music, and even went to a few local art galleries that Leah adored. But as things progressed, Ethan found himself growing more nervous. His feelings for Leah were becoming undeniable, but the fear of getting hurt still lingered in the back of his mind. Every time he looked at her, smiling, carefree, he wondered if it was too good to be true. He had been down this road before, falling for someone, only to have it all come crashing down. One evening, as they sat on a quiet stretch of beach, Ethan felt the weight of his emotions pressing down on him. Leah was sitting next to him, her feet buried in the sand, watching the waves roll in. "You know," Leah began, breaking the comfortable silence, "I've really enjoyed spending time with you these past few weeks. I feel like I can be myself around you." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He looked over at her, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the setting sun. "I've enjoyed it too," he admitted, his voice quieter than usual. Leah turned to face him, sensing the change in his tone. "But?" she asked, her eyes searching his. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know. It's just, I've been through some stuff, you know? And sometimes I wonder if it's even worth trying again. Leah didn't respond right away. Instead, she shifted closer to him, her gaze steady and calm. Ethan, I get it. I've been hurt too. But that doesn't mean we should stop ourselves from feeling something real when it's right in front of us. Her words hit Ethan hard. He wanted to believe her, to believe that this time things would be different. But the scars of his past weren't so easily ignored. He had spent so long guarding his heart that he wasn't sure how to let those walls down again. I'm just afraid, he admitted, his voice barely audible. Leah reached out and took his hand, her fingers warm against his skin. We're all afraid, but sometimes the only way to get past the fear is to take the risk. Ethan looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, he realized that Leah wasn't asking for perfection. She wasn't expecting him to have everything figured out. She was just offering him a chance to take things one day at a time, to build something slowly and see where it led. Maybe that was enough. Ethan's nights were different now, brighter, lighter, full of laughter and conversation. Every evening with Leah felt like a step away from the darkness he had lived in for so long. But with each step forward, the fear in his chest grew. It was the quiet fear of a man who had been broken before, who knew how quickly things could fall apart. They hadn't defined what they were. Not yet. There was no rush, no pressure. Yet in the back of his mind, Ethan couldn't stop wondering, what if this falls apart too? What if I'm just setting myself up for another heartbreak? Weeks turned into months, and it became clear to everyone around them that Ethan and Leah were something special. Ethan's close friends, who hadn't seen him truly smile in years, started teasing him about the change. You're glowing, man. His friend Jordan said one afternoon as they walked through Wynwood Walls, an outdoor art district Leah had introduced him to. Who is this girl? Leah, right? I gotta meet her. Ethan laughed it off, trying to hide the happiness he felt. She's just, I don't know, man. She's different. I haven't felt like this in a long time. But the closer he got to Leah, the more Ethan's insecurities began to creep in. They didn't talk about the future much, but whenever they did, Ethan's thoughts raced. Would she get tired of him? Would she wake up one day and realize he wasn't enough? His last relationship had ended with those very words. His ex had simply said, I'm sorry, but I just don't feel the same way anymore. That was the fear that haunted Ethan. One night, after a long walk by the water, Leah invited Ethan to her apartment for the first time. It was small but cozy, filled with artwork she had collected over the years and plants that gave the space a natural warmth. As Ethan sat on her couch, Leah excused herself to grab some wine from the kitchen. Ethan looked around the room, his eyes landing on a small photo on the bookshelf. It was Leah and a man, tall, dark-haired, with his arm around her. They looked close, happy. Ethan felt his stomach twist. He knew Leah had a past, just like he did. But seeing that photo made it real in a way he hadn't expected. Who was he? Was this someone she still cared about? Leah returned with 2 glasses of wine, smiling as she handed one to Ethan. She followed his gaze to the photo and immediately picked it up, her expression softening. That's Tomas, she said quietly. We were together for 3 years. He was a good guy, but things didn't work out. Ethan nodded, trying to keep his voice steady. Why didn't it work out? Leah took a sip of her wine and sighed. We just wanted different things. He was ready to settle down, get married, but I wasn't in that place yet. I needed space to figure myself out, and he didn't understand that. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He was relieved, but a part of him couldn't shake the thought that Leah might still be figuring things out. Was she truly ready for something serious now? Was he just filling a temporary void? Sensing his hesitation, Leah sat down beside him, placing the glass on the coffee table. Ethan, I'm not with him anymore for a reason. And yeah, I'm still figuring out my life, but I know what I want now. Her words were sincere, but Ethan still felt that familiar doubt gnawing at him. Could he believe her? Could he trust that this wasn't just another chapter in Leah's journey that would eventually close, leaving him behind? Do you really? He asked, his voice quiet, but filled with the weight of his insecurities. Leah's expression shifted, her smile fading slightly. Yeah, I do. But I get that the feeling you're not sure about me. The truth was, Ethan wasn't sure about anything. Not because of Leah, but because of himself. His past relationship had left him questioning his worth, and no matter how perfect Leah seemed, he couldn't shake the feeling that she'd wake up one day and decide he wasn't enough. Ethan stood up, pacing the small apartment. "It's not you, Leah. It's me. I've been through this before. I fell for someone, thought everything was perfect, and then one day, it all came crashing down. She just decided she didn't want me anymore." Leah's eyes softened with understanding, but she didn't interrupt. She let Ethan speak, her silence filled with patience. "And now, here I am, falling for you, and I'm terrified that the same thing is going to happen again. That you'll wake up one day and realize you don't want me either." Leah stood, crossing the room to where Ethan stood. She placed her hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. "Ethan, I'm not her, and yeah, I don't have all the answers. I don't know what the future holds. But I do know that I care about you. I want to be with you. And if you don't want to take that risk with me, I understand. But don't push me away because of something that happened in the past." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. Leah's words were everything he wanted to hear, but the fear was still there, lurking in the shadows. He wanted to believe her, to trust that this was different. But how could he know for sure? Leah stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. "If we're going to make this work, you have to let go of the past. I'm not asking you to forget what happened, but you have to stop letting it control you." Ethan swallowed hard, his mind racing. Leah was right. He had been letting his past dictate his present, keeping him from fully embracing what they had. But was he ready to take that leap of faith? For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the distant hum of the city outside the window. Ethan looked into Leah's eyes, searching for something. Some sign, some guarantee that things would be okay. But life didn't offer guarantees. That was the truth he had been running from. Finally, Ethan took a deep breath, letting the tension in his body melt away. He reached out, taking Leah's hand in his. "I want to try," he said quietly. "I don't know if I'm ready, but I want to try." Leah smiled, her eyes bright with emotion. "That's all I'm asking." They stood there for a moment, the weight of Ethan's fears slowly lifting. For the first time, he realized that maybe it wasn't about knowing for sure. Maybe it was about choosing to believe, even when the future was uncertain. From that night on, things between Ethan and Leah shifted. Their bond grew stronger, more honest, as they started opening up about their fears, hopes, and dreams. They didn't pretend to have it all figured out, but they were willing to face whatever came next together. But just when Ethan began to feel secure in their relationship, life threw them an unexpected curveball. Leah's phone rang one evening, and as she answered it, Ethan could see her expression change. Her face drained of color, her hand trembling slightly. "It's my dad," Leah whispered after hanging up the call. "He had a stroke." Ethan felt his heart drop. Leah had told him how close she was to her father, how much she admired his strength and wisdom. Now, that foundation in her life was crumbling. Ethan reached for her, pulling her into a tight embrace as she fought back tears. "I have to go back to LA, Leah said, her voice cracking. "I don't know for how long." Ethan's mind raced. Everything between them had been going so well, and now this, a distance neither of them had prepared for. His greatest fear was coming true. Something was pulling Leah away, and he didn't know if she would come back. Ethan sat in stunned silence after Leah told him the news about her father. The words lingered in the air, heavy with the weight of uncertainty. He knew how close Leah was to her family, how important her father was to her. This wasn't just a trip, it was something that could turn her world upside down. And his too. "I'll help you pack," Ethan finally said, trying to keep his voice steady. But inside, panic swelled. Leah going back to Los Angeles could change everything. She might be gone for weeks, months, or even longer. Would their fragile new relationship survive? Leah gave him a weak smile, her eyes filled with gratitude but also sadness. "Thanks. I really don't know how long I'll be there, but I need to go. I have to be with him." Ethan nodded, understanding her need, even though it terrified him. "Of course, family comes first," he replied, trying to mask his own fear with reassurance. But deep inside, old insecurities were resurfacing. What if she didn't come back? What if their connection wasn't strong enough to survive this distance? The next day, Ethan drove Leah to the airport. The car ride was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Leah's phone buzzed constantly with updates from her family, while Ethan gripped the steering wheel a little too tightly, trying to focus on anything but the ticking clock. When they arrived at Miami International Airport, the reality of the situation hit him hard. Leah was leaving, and there was no telling when she would return. As they stood at the departure gate, Leah turned to Ethan with a worried look. "I'm really sorry about all of this. I know it's sudden and it's the worst timing," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Ethan shook his head, pulling her into a tight hug. "Don't apologize. You need to be with your family. I get it." Leah looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I'll call you as soon as I get there. I don't want this us to end, okay?" Ethan nodded, though a knot tightened in his chest. "We'll figure it out. Just focus on your dad right now." With a quick kiss goodbye, Leah disappeared through security, leaving Ethan standing alone in the bustling airport. As he watched her walk away, an unsettling thought echoed in his mind. What if this is the last time I see her like this? At first, Ethan tried to keep himself busy. He went back to his usual routines, work, the gym, catching up with friends, but everything felt empty without Leah. He would pick up his phone to text her, only to remember that she was on the other side of the country, dealing with something far bigger than either of them. Leah called and texted as much as she could, but the conversations were short and often strained. Between hospital visits, dealing with her family, and the emotional toll of her father's condition, Leah was exhausted. And it showed. One evening, while sitting alone in his apartment, Ethan received a message from Leah that made his heart sink. "Leah, I miss you. This is harder than I thought it would be." Ethan read the text over and over, his mind racing. He wanted to be there for her, to make her feel better, but what could he do from 3,000 miles away? He typed out several replies before finally settling on, "Ethan, I miss you too. I wish I could be there with you." The response felt inadequate, but what else could he say? He hated this distance. Hated that he couldn't be by her side when she needed someone the most. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing day, Ethan felt more disconnected. Leah's calls became less frequent, her texts more brief. She was completely overwhelmed by her father's condition. And though Ethan understood, it didn't make the growing distance between them any easier to bear. One night, after a particularly difficult day, Ethan found himself staring at his phone, wondering if Leah still felt the same way about him. What if the distance is making her second-guess everything? It was a thought that gnawed at him constantly. One evening, a month after Leah had left, Ethan received a call from her. But this time, her voice didn't carry the usual warmth. It was strained, fragile. "Ethan, I need to talk to you," Leah began, and immediately his heart sank. He knew that tone. It was the same voice his ex had used when she told him things weren't working anymore. "What's going on?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm, though his pulse quickened. Leah sighed heavily on the other end of the line. "This whole thing with my dad, it's been a lot. And being here, back in LA, with my family, it's brought up a lot of stuff for me. Things I didn't realize I hadn't dealt with." Ethan's throat tightened. "What are you saying?" "I don't know if I can come back to Miami, at least not for a while," she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "My family needs me here, and I need to figure some things out. I don't want to string you along, Ethan. You deserve more than this." Uncertainty. For a moment, Ethan felt like the ground beneath him was crumbling. He had feared this conversation for weeks, but now that it was happening, he didn't know what to say. His mind raced, trying to find the right words to convince her to come back, to remind her of what they had. But instead, he found himself saying, "I get it, Leah. You have to do what's best for you and your family." Leah was quiet for a long moment. "I still care about you, Ethan. I don't want this to be the end, but I also don't want to hold you back. I don't know how long I'll be here." Ethan closed his eyes, fighting back the wave of disappointment. He cared about her too, more than he had realized until that moment. But he knew that pressuring her wouldn't help either of them. "I care about you too," he finally said, his voice soft. "But I think we both need to figure out what's next for us." Leah let out a shaky breath, and Ethan could almost hear the tears in her voice. "Yeah, I think so too." After that call, things between Ethan and Leah shifted. They still talked, but the frequency and intensity of their conversations dwindled. Leah was consumed with her father's recovery, and Ethan, despite his best efforts, couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness. He threw himself back into work, but every day felt like a struggle. His friends noticed the change in him, but when they asked, Ethan brushed it off. He didn't want to talk about it. He didn't want to admit that the relationship he had once thought might heal him was now on the verge of slipping away. Weeks turned into months. Leah stayed in LA and Ethan remained in Miami, trying to move forward but feeling stuck in limbo. He went out with friends, even went on a few dates, but nothing felt right. He was still tethered to the memory of Leah, of what they had and what they could have had. Then, one evening, Ethan received an unexpected call from Leah. "Ethan, I'm coming back," she said, her voice trembling with both excitement and fear. "My dad's doing better, and I've finally sorted things out here. I know it's been a long time, but I'm ready to come back, if you're still there." Ethan's heart raced, but this time it wasn't fear that gripped him. It was hope. "I've always been here, Leah," he replied, a small smile forming on his face, "and I'll be here when you get back." The weeks leading up to Leah's return felt like a blur to Ethan. Every day he checked his phone for updates, and every night he thought about what it would be like to see her again. The months apart had been painful, but the hope of her return stirred something deep within him, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to embrace in a long time. Love. Still, Ethan couldn't shake the nervous energy buzzing through his veins. He didn't know what to expect when Leah finally arrived back in Miami. Would they pick up where they left off? Or had the time apart changed them both too much? Leah texted him the night before her flight. "Landing tomorrow afternoon. I can't wait to see you." Ethan stared at the message, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't wait to see her either. But the fear of the unknown hung over him like a shadow. A part of him was still scared that after all this time, things wouldn't feel the same. But another part of him, the part that had slowly grown stronger over the months, was willing to take the risk. The next day, Ethan stood at the arrival gate of Miami International Airport, shifting his weight from foot to foot. He kept glancing at the screen that displayed incoming flights, his heart racing as Leah's flight status changed to arrived. He felt a mixture of excitement and anxiety. What if things are awkward? What if we've drifted too far apart? The doubts swirled in his mind, but as passengers began filing out of the gate, all those thoughts vanished the moment he saw her. Leah stepped through the doors, pulling her suitcase behind her. She looked exhausted, a little thinner, and her eyes held a weariness he hadn't seen before. But when her eyes met his, they lit up with the same warmth that had drawn him to her in the first place. Ethan took a deep breath and stepped forward, his nerves suddenly giving way to something else, something that had been building up inside him for months. "Leah," he whispered, barely able to contain the emotions surging through him. Leah dropped her suitcase and closed the distance between them in a few quick steps, throwing her arms around his neck. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They just held each other, as if afraid that letting go would mean losing everything they had fought for. "I missed you so much," Leah said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "I didn't realize how much until I saw you." Ethan pulled back slightly, just enough to look at her face. Her eyes were brimming with unshed tears, but her smile was radiant. "I missed you too," he replied softly. "Every day." They stood there, lost in the crowd of people moving around them, but in that moment, nothing else mattered. It was as if the months of distance, uncertainty, and fear had melted away in an instant. Leah looked up at him, her hands resting on his chest. "I was so afraid that this would feel different, that I'd come back and things wouldn't be the same." Ethan shook his head, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "It's not the same. It's better." Leah laughed softly, a sound that made Ethan's heart swell. "I was hoping you'd say that." Over the next few weeks, Ethan and Leah eased back into their relationship, but they both knew things weren't going to be as simple as picking up where they left off. The months apart had changed them both in ways they hadn't anticipated. Leah had spent months in Los Angeles, not just caring for her father, but also confronting unresolved issues from her past. Her need for independence, the weight of her family's expectations, and her fear of committing to something real. She had come back to Miami determined to move forward, not just with Ethan, but with her own life. Ethan, on the other hand, had spent those months learning to trust again. The distance had forced him to confront his deepest insecurities, the fear that he wasn't enough, that people he loved would always leave. But now, with Leah standing by his side, he realized that love wasn't about certainty. It was about choosing to stay, even when things were uncertain. One night, as they sat on the beach under the stars, Leah turned to Ethan, her expression serious. "There's something I need to tell you," she began, her voice quiet but steady. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He had been waiting for this, waiting for the other shoe to drop. But he nodded, bracing himself for whatever was coming. "I'm not the same person I was when I left," Leah admitted. "Being with my family, dealing with my dad's illness, it changed me. And I realized that I want different things now. I want to settle down, to really commit to someone. To you." Ethan blinked, taken aback. This was the last thing he had expected. "You want to settle down? With me?" Leah nodded, a soft smile tugging at her lips. "Yeah, I've spent so much time running away from everything, commitment, love, my own fears. But being away from you made me realize that I don't want to run anymore. I want to be with you, Ethan. Really be with you." For a moment, Ethan couldn't speak. The words he had been waiting to hear for months, maybe even years, were finally being said to him. And yet, part of him still struggled to believe it. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're not going to wake up one day and decide you don't want this anymore?" Leah reached out, taking his hand in hers. "No, I'm not going to wake up and leave. I'm not going to change my mind. I've been running my whole life, and I'm tired of it. I want to stay." Ethan looked into her eyes, searching for any sign of doubt, but all he saw was sincerity. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this was real. "I love you, Leah," he said, the words spilling out before he could stop them. Leah's breath hitched, and for a moment she just stared at him, her eyes wide with surprise. But then, slowly, her lips curved into a smile. "I love you too, Ethan." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of those words hanging between them, and then, without another word, Ethan leaned in and kissed her. It was soft, gentle, but filled with all the emotions he had been holding back for so long. In that kiss, there was no fear, no hesitation, just love. Over the next few months, Ethan and Leah rebuilt their lives together. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of doubt, arguments about their past, and fears that surfaced when they least expected them. But through it all, they chose to stay. They chose each other. Leah found a job with a local design agency in Miami, allowing her to finally plant roots in the city she had once thought would be a temporary escape. Ethan, who had returned to work after their time apart, found that his career no longer felt like the weight it once had. With Leah by his side, everything seemed lighter. Their love grew stronger, not because it was perfect, but because they had learned to embrace the imperfections. They had faced their fears, their insecurities, and their doubts, and they had come out on the other side. Together. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of Ethan's apartment, watching the Miami skyline glitter in the distance, Leah leaned her head on his shoulder. "You know," she said softly, "I used to think love was this big, dramatic thing. But now I realize it's just about choosing the same person every day, no matter what." Ethan smiled, kissing the top of her head. "I couldn't agree more." And in that moment, Ethan knew that despite all the obstacles they had faced, distance, fear, uncertainty, they had found something real. Something worth fighting for. They had found love. Months passed, and as the hot Miami summer gave way to the cooler breezes of fall, Ethan and Leah found themselves settling into a life that felt real, stable, but not without its challenges. They had faced their fears, and in doing so had discovered that love wasn't some grand, elusive thing. It was in the small moments. Waking up next to each other, sharing late-night conversations on the balcony, laughing over burned dinners, and finding comfort in silence. Ethan had changed. He was no longer the man who had walked into that café months ago, broken and convinced that love wasn't meant for him. Leah had changed too. Her fear of commitment, her tendency to run when things got tough, had faded. Together, they had grown stronger, not just as individuals, but as partners. One Saturday morning, as they sipped coffee at their favorite beachside café, the very place where they had first met, Leah looked over at Ethan with a soft smile. "Do you ever think about how different things would be if we hadn't met that day?" Ethan smiled, thinking back to that moment, how a single smile had sparked something in him, something he hadn't even realized he still had. Hope. "All the time," he admitted. "It's funny, isn't it? How one moment can change everything." Leah nodded, her eyes bright as she reached across the table to take his hand. "Yeah, it is. And I'm glad it did." Despite their emotional growth, life wasn't always smooth. They still had disagreements, small ones about where to eat, and bigger ones about the future. Leah's job as a graphic designer kept her busy, and Ethan's work in finance was demanding. But through it all, they communicated in a way they hadn't before. They didn't let the small things fester, and when the big issues arose, they faced them together. One evening after a particularly long week, Ethan sat on the couch, flipping through channels, when Leah sat down beside him, her face unusually serious. "I've been thinking," she said quietly. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. It was the kind of tone that usually signaled something important. "About what?" he asked, keeping his voice calm. Leah shifted slightly, turning to face him. "About us, about the future." Ethan tensed, waiting for her to drop some kind of bombshell, but instead, Leah's expression softened. "I love what we have, Ethan. I love the life we've built here, but I want more." His heart started to race again, but this time for a different reason. "More?" Leah nodded. "Yeah, I don't want to rush anything, but I want to know, do you see a future with me? Do you see us getting married, maybe starting a family one day?" Ethan stared at her for a moment, his mind processing the question. It wasn't that he hadn't thought about it. He had, many times. But hearing Leah say it aloud made everything feel more real. He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "Leah, I do see a future with you. I don't know when or how everything will happen, but I know I want to spend the rest of my life with you." Leah's eyes softened, and for the first time in a long time, she looked truly at peace. That's all I needed to hear. Months later, on a quiet evening, Ethan stood nervously in their apartment, holding a small velvet box in his hand. Leah had gone out to run some errands, and he had spent the entire day rehearsing what he was going to say. He wasn't a man of grand gestures. He didn't want to propose on some elaborate vacation or in front of a crowd. That wasn't them. Their relationship had always been about the small moments, the intimate conversations, and the quiet strength they had built together. So when Leah walked through the door, tired but smiling, Ethan took a deep breath. "Hey," she said, dropping her bags on the kitchen counter. "You look nervous. What's up?" Ethan chuckled, feeling his heart pound in his chest. "There's something I've been thinking about for a while." Leah raised an eyebrow, clearly curious but not expecting what was about to happen. "Oh, what's that?" Ethan took a step toward her, reaching into his pocket and pulling out the ring. Leah's eyes widened in shock as she realized what was happening. "Leah," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I've spent most of my life afraid of getting hurt. I thought love wasn't for me, that I wasn't meant to find someone who truly understood me. And then, you walked into that cafe and changed everything." Leah's eyes filled with tears, her hands covering her mouth as she watched him. "I don't want to spend another day wondering what if," Ethan continued, his own voice catching slightly. "I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I want to face every challenge, every joy, every moment together." He got down on one knee, holding the ring up to her. "Leah Martinez, will you marry me?" Leah didn't hesitate. She nodded, tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "Yes, yes, Ethan, I will." Ethan stood, slipping the ring onto her finger, and they kissed, the world around them fading away. It was just the two of them, standing in their apartment, committing to a future they had both been afraid to believe in for so long. As time passed, Ethan and Leah built a life that was not defined by perfection, but by love, resilience, and trust. They didn't need grand gestures or dramatic declarations. Their love was in the everyday moments. Cooking dinner together, walking along the beach, and sitting quietly on the balcony, watching the Miami skyline glitter in the distance. They married a year later, in a small, intimate ceremony on the beach. Only their closest friends and family were there. And as they exchanged vows, it wasn't just about promising a future together. It was about acknowledging the journey that had brought them to this point. The challenges, the fears, the distance, and the growth they had both undergone. Leah's father, fully recovered, smiled proudly from the front row, and Ethan's friends, who had seen him at his lowest, couldn't stop commenting on how much he had changed. Not just in how he carried himself, but in how happy he looked. Truly happy. And as they stood on that beach, surrounded by the people they loved, Ethan realized that love wasn't something to be feared. It wasn't about avoiding pain or shielding yourself from heartbreak. It was about taking the risk, knowing that the possibility of loss made the moments of joy that much sweeter. Leah looked up at him, her eyes filled with the same warmth and love that had drawn him in all those months ago. "We made it," she whispered, squeezing his hand. Ethan smiled, pulling her close. "Yeah, we did." They had come full circle. From a chance encounter in a café to a life built on trust and love, Ethan and Leah had found something real, something worth holding on to. And this time, neither of them was letting go. Years later, Ethan and Leah sat together on their balcony, the Miami skyline shimmering in the distance. The life they had built was one of love, understanding, and patience. They had grown together, weathering storms and celebrating victories, both big and small. Their first child, a daughter named Amara, played quietly in the living room, her laughter filling the apartment. Parenthood had brought its own set of challenges, but like everything else, Ethan and Leah faced them together. With open hearts and an unwavering commitment to each other. Leah rested her head on Ethan's shoulder, watching the sunset. "Do you ever think about that first day, when we met at the cafe?" Ethan smiled, kissing the top of her head. "All the time," Leah laughed softly. "I'm glad you picked up my phone that day. Who knows what would have happened if you hadn't?" Ethan chuckled. "Yeah, who knows?" They sat there in comfortable silence, watching the day fade into night, knowing that no matter what the future held, they would face it together, and that, Ethan realized, was all he had ever wanted. You won't believe what happened between Laura and David after years of silence. Want to know how they dealt with the guilt and shocking revelations at their reunion? Click the video on your screen and find out if the past can truly be forgiven.